Just a note before we get into this episode. This episode of True Crime Conversations contains discussions of kidnapping and sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised. It's February 2016, dry and uncomfortably warm, when 23-year-old Brazilian backpacker Beatriz meets a German backpacker of the same age named Lena. They strike up a quick friendship in an Adelaide hostel and share plans to make their way down to Melbourne, more than 700 kilometres south. They've heard about the Great Ocean Road, 243 kilometres of winding terrain along the coast, passing world-famous landmarks like the 12 Apostles. The trip would be an 8-hour drive, manageable in just a day. So they do what most backpackers do. They connect to some Wi-Fi and scroll through Gumtree in search of someone who will drive them. Soon, they'll be in a 4-wheel drive with a 59-year-old man named Roman, who has agreed to take them where they need to go. Beatriz will even snap a picture in the passenger seat, smiling, wearing aviator sunglasses, and capturing a distracted Lena in the back. But what unfolds in the next 12 hours will be a set of attacks so brutal, their story has come to be known as a real-life Wolf Creek. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast looking into the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with Sean Fewster, Chief Court Reporter for the Adelaide Advertiser and best-selling author of City of Evil. Sean covered the case of the Salt Creek attacks, where 2 backpackers were kept hostage by a man pretending to be a helpful stranger who would put these 2 women through the most sinister and vile assault. I want to begin in February 2016 when 2 young women met in a hostel. What can you tell us about those 2 women?
Both those young women were looking for an adventure in Australia. Lena was from Germany, Beatriz from Brazil, and while they had similar goals, they'd come from very different perspectives. Lena was looking for a big adventure. She'd never travelled by herself before. Beatriz was finishing off her nursing studies and had found love in Australia. She wanted to look around by herself as well. The 2 of them had a shared dream of seeing the Great Ocean Road, and so they decided that if Beatriz could get them a ride, they'd share it together.
And was that their plan on travelling there, that they would have someone drive them?
It's actually a fairly common thing we've come to learn. It seems that there's a fairly big community on Gumtree where people will just advertise for ride sharing. Hey, I'm off in this direction. Who's also heading in that direction? Is anybody going to Melbourne? Is anybody going to Darwin? And while it may seem strange to many of us, a lot of people take it up on that. There's all these people under the age of 30 that are quite happy to jump in a car with each other, go off in a direction, make some new friends, have some life experiences, and then move on to the next car, the next life experience.
And did they know anything about the person who they found on Gumtree who offered to take them? Did they know anything at first about him? Did they provide on Gumtree a sense of who they are or what they do or how old they are or anything?
There was no sense of how old the person driving them was going to be, but it gets a little stranger than that. Originally, Beatriz had signed up with a different driver who she did know to be roughly in the same age bracket as her and Lena. And that was the person they were going to travel with. The night before the trip, that man got in contact with them and said, I'm sorry, my car's broken down. It's not going to be fixed in time. I'm just not going to be able to make the trip. Because Beatriz and Lena didn't want to wait, they went with their plan B, who was Roman Heinze. And while they had a sense that Roman was a little bit older than them, they certainly didn't expect him to be so much older than them. He talked about being a fisher, he talked about being a camper, he talked about knowing the area well, but he hadn't really given them a proper idea of who and what he was.
And how old was he?
Yeah, I believe he was 58 at the time.
I got 2 main responses. First, a guy that it was the one that I wanted to go, but the night before he had a problem with his car, so I had to cancel with him. And that's when I called to my second option, which was Roman. I just thought he was a bit impatient. That's the feeling that I had, because he was sending me a message like, just be nice with me, just send me a message, just answer if you want to go or not. But I didn't have so many options.
And when they met Roman, what did he look like?
Certainly nothing like they expected. He was stood 198 centimetres tall, which is, 6 foot 6 inches in the old measurements, and very dark, very swarthy, big Merv Hughes style handlebar moustache, little bit balding at the front but thick hair at the back, very gaunt and drawn face. Very large man, and certainly not what they'd been expecting. Dressed very much in the way of, a northern suburbs Adelaide person, button-up flannel shirt, jeans, boots, looking like a camper, looking like a fisherman. Certainly not what two young girls would expect would be the sort of person advertising on Gumtree to take them on a trip.
So he picks them up and they start the journey to Melbourne. What did they think of him? What was their sense of him in those sort of first few hours?
Lena and Beatriz have said that they both had individual thoughts of, this isn't what we were expecting. He's a lot older than we thought he was going to be. But at first, everything seemed fairly normal. He seemed like a nice enough guy. He was quite pleasant to speak to, even if he didn't speak very much. He was focused on getting them where they were going, prepared to point out bits and pieces along the way. And Beatriz in the front seat, Lena in the back seat, both felt comfortable enough, at least until they got to Salt Creek.
And was the idea that they were going to stop overnight? Is that how long the journey is, that you would need to stop?
There's really no need to do an overnight stop going from Adelaide to Melbourne. You can do it in a single 8-hour jag if you want to. A lot of people do stop overnight, but the stop overnight that Roman took wasn't planned. As they were moving through past the Salt Creek Roadhouse, he took a right-hand turn off the main road and said, I know a great place we can camp, and then took them 2 or 3 kilometres out through the sand dunes, out through the salt pan, out toward a very isolated stretch of beach and said, I love this place, it's great for fishing, let's stop here for the night.
And what did the two young women think of that? Did that make them nervous?
This was the first time that either of them had, by their own admission, any concerns. They pulled up in the car. Roman got out and started setting up tents, setting up one of those little plastic folding tables, getting the cooking equipment out. And the girls shared a sort of quick conversation of, was this the plan? This is really odd. But they decided, obviously it's going to be okay. What have we got to worry about? So Lena was very tired at that point. She decided she was going to have a sleep inside the car on the back seat while the others got the cooking ready, got dinner ready. Beatriz changed into her bikini and started enjoying the weather and getting ready for the evening.
The first impression that I had, it was weird because he looked like older than what I was expecting.
I was thinking the same. I thought okay, Beatriz is here too, and that made me feel safer than it would normally do.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I would have gone with him all alone.
Yeah, me too.
Was it unusual for people to stay at a place like Salt Creek overnight? Because it wasn't a campground, was it? It was just sort of an isolated, desolate kind of area.
Salt Creek's actually really, really beautiful. The first time I got to see it was when I went down for the jury view during the trial, and it is miles and miles of unspoiled Australian beach. Like, this is exactly the sort of beach that you imagine when someone talks about rugged Australian coastline, sand dunes and pristine white sand. That's all on first blush anyway. The current in the water is unforgiving and the surf is unbearable when it tries to beat down on things. Also, the beach is actually seeded with lots of really thin, almost razor-sharp shells, most of which are pointing straight up into your feet or into the wheels. So it's lovely to look at, really inhospitable when you get to it. And that even lends itself to the way you get there. To actually get to this part of Salt Creek, you have to go across an open salt pan area that floods regularly, and you have to climb a really large sandhill that only the best four-wheel drive experts can get up without too much of an incident. So you can camp there, if you're going to go there, it's inevitable that you're going to camp there because you might end up cut off by that inlet of water that I was talking about. So it's not completely unusual to camp there. But in terms of we're going to Melbourne to the Great Ocean Road, this is not where you expect to stop.
So while Lena slept, Roman asked Beatriz if she wanted to look for kangaroos because they were sort of on the other side of a dune. What happened once they left and went for that walk?
Yeah, well, Roman claimed there were kangaroos on the other side of the dune. He claimed that he had seen some tracks in the sand, and maybe if they went a little bit further into the dunes, they'd be able to see them. So Beatriz went with him. They walked for a period of time, and it's quite easy to cover a fair amount of distance in Salt Creek fairly quickly. There's really not much to stop you apart from scrub and sand grasses and those shells. After a while, she said, there's not much around, we should probably head back. That's when Roman grabbed her from behind. He reached around with one arm, locked her up from behind, and then pushed her down face first into the sand. He climbed onto her back and pulled out a length of rope, which she didn't even realize he had, along with a knife. He reached forward and stabbed the knife into the sand in front of her, almost as if a statement to say, I'm in charge now, and started trying to tie her wrists and her ankles with the rope.
What was his plan? What was his plan with her? What did he do next?
At that point, Beatriz had no idea what was going on, so she simply fought. She struggled. She actually managed to grab one of the lengths of the rope and throw it as far as she could. Roman responded by rolling her onto her back and punching her, saying, you can either do this my way or it's going to get worse. So she decided she was going to play along for now and try to figure out what was going on. So Roman bound her feet, bound her wrists, and then used the knife to actually cut the bikini off of her body. Started trying to kiss her, trying to lick her, trying to touch her. She's desperately trying to fight out of this, trying to get away from him. And again, more slaps, more punches, calm down, do things my way. This will all be easier if you just do it my way. And it was pretty obvious pretty quickly what his intentions were.
And she was quite quick thinking in terms of steering him in a different direction. She ended up convincing him to go back to where they were camping, didn't she?
That's right. Beatriz says the first thing that went through her mind was an image of herself, her own body dead in the sand dunes, and her mother having to come all the way from Brazil to identify her body. She was convinced she was going to die right there in those sand dunes, so she decided, I can't let that happen. So as you say, she said to Roman, hey, look, you don't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be this way. Let's just go. If you want to do something with me, we can do it back at the camp. Let's go back to the tent. Let's have a drink. Let's be calm. Let's chill out. Let's have some fun together. We can do that. It was all a plan. She had no intention of carrying through with this. I mean, she's a beautiful, intelligent, vivacious young woman from the other side of the world, and he's this gross, hulking, middle-aged scumbag. There's no way she's interested in him, but she knows she's got to pretend long enough to get back, at least within earshot of Lena, so she can get some help. So imagine this. You're naked on the sand. The shells are already cutting into your body. You've had this horrific man pushing you down into that sand. He helps you back up to go back to the camp, but he leaves your wrists and your ankles tied. So you're walking barefoot over razor-sharp shells, inching forward, ankle by ankle, back towards this camp, hoping that you can keep him going long enough to actually get some help. And the terrifying thing is they were almost all the way back to the camp when Roman decided, no, we're going to turn back. I don't like this. And so Beatriz realized she had exactly one chance to save her own life. So she just let fly with the loudest scream of Lena she could possibly manage. She knew she was only going to get to do it once. And she was right, because as soon as the name escaped her lips, Roman slammed her back down to the sand again.
Once I turned around to go towards the campsite, that's when he grabbed me. At the beginning, like the first, I think, split of seconds, I just thought it was a joke. I just didn't get. And then it's like, no, it's no fun. What are you doing? Look. And then I realized that it wasn't a joke. He was on my back, and he put his arm around my neck and put me down. He grabbed a knife that he had on his back, and he put on the sand. And then he got some pieces of ropes, tried to tie my arms and my legs, my ankles. But once I realized that he was trying to do, I grabbed the rope and throw them away. He said to me, either you make it easy or I'm gonna break your arm. So I said, okay, I'm not gonna piss him off. I'm gonna just do it. It wasn't the right moment to piss him off.
And what did Lena do when she heard that scream?
Lena woke up, thankfully. I mean, how she heard that scream over the sound of the surf and the wind whipping down is a miracle in itself. You know, inside the car, sound asleep, and yet she managed to hear that. So she leaps out of the car, and just imagine the tableau that's before her there. There's her friend on the ground. Roman's over her. Doesn't know what's going on. So Lena runs toward them screaming, let her go, get off her. What the hell do you think you're doing? Roman turns around and looks at Lena and says, I just wanted to try her. Before Lena can really process what that means, and by her own admission, she didn't figure that out for a couple of hours. You know, just so shocking and confronting was this that she couldn't put the pieces together. It was too surprising. By this point, Beatriz, who's down on the ground, looks up at Roman. Roman's now facing away from her. She can see that tucked down his belt, he's not only got that knife from earlier, but he's got a long wooden handle. She's got no idea whether it's a hammer or whether it's an axe. So she screams, Lena, run, he's got an axe. Lena turns around and runs back toward the four-wheel drive that brought them there. She gets to the car. She pulls open the door. She grabs her bags. And she even yells out, I'm just getting my bags. Roman responds, get your fucking bags then. And that's when he strikes her with the hammer for the first time in the back of the head.
And at that stage, are the women sort of separate? Have they separated? And is he pursuing one rather than the other?
At this point, it's all within a short space of time. If you imagine the entrance where they came into the beach, Beatriz is close-ish to that. The car is further along, and at this point, Roman and Lena are at the car. So Roman strikes Lena with the hammer once. She falls backwards. She's already bleeding profusely, and she starts running. Roman pursues her and manages to strike her with the hammer 3 more times. Every single time, Lena manages to find the wherewithal to get up and keep running. Obviously, that frustrates Heinze because he decides he's not going to worry about the hammer anymore. He turns around, heads back to the car, and starts getting in it and turning on the ignition. Meanwhile, Lena manages to make it back to Beatriz and unties her. And in that moment, that split second before they hear the roar of the engine behind them, these two women look at each other and realise, almost instantaneously, the only way they're going to survive is if they go in different directions. So Lena sprints straight forward, heading down the beach back toward the entrance to the area. Beatriz, who again is naked at this point, runs back over those razor-sharp shells, back through the sand dunes, back through the seagrass, and hides as low as she can get. Their reasoning, it's possible only one of them is going to survive, but one of them has to. Heinze drives initially toward where Beatriz is going, then realises that Lena's actually heading back toward the entrance, which means possibly she could get help, and so turns the car around and goes after her.
And what does he do when he gets to Lena?
Lena thinks that the best thing she can do is to take a left-hand turn and run into the sand dunes. Different area to where Beatriz is. Try to lose Roman between the sand dunes, but he's following her in this four-wheel drive. And for the next kilometre, he's chasing her. Now, Lena is tiny. She's maybe 5 feet tall if she's lucky. She's an absolute pocket rocket of a human being. Like, incredible strength, incredible passion, incredible endurance, but she's tiny. Yet she's flying because they measured afterwards and her footsteps when she was running were 4 feet apart. 4 feet between footprints. Can you imagine the desperation and the panic that set in to make someone run so fast that their footprints are 4 feet apart? She's flying as fast as she possibly can, and Heinze is coming after her in this four-wheel drive. Now, during the trial, I actually rode in a four-wheel drive and we followed the path that Lena took. Our car nearly tipped a couple of times. She figured out pretty quickly how to take him through the worst possible route. Yet he kept the car going, and every time he caught up to her, he rammed her at full the speed he can manage with the bull bar.
How is she still running at this point? Because as you say, she's been attacked in a really vicious, violent way, and now she's been hit by an enormous car. How is she still on 2 feet?
Pure bloody willpower, to be honest. I mean, she's bleeding profusely from 4 ragged wounds in her scalp. She's still fortunate that her skull didn't split, but her scalp was actually completely split. Massive gashes, they would later discover. She's losing blood at a huge rate. I don't know whether you've ever had a scalp wound or any of the audience has had a scalp wound, but there's a reason that in stunt work, if you need somebody to bleed for the show, for the visual, you injure the scalp, because all you've got to do is get your heart pumping and it will just keep bleeding. And it's a horrible look. It doesn't hurt you as badly as it looks. But Lena, of course, had the concussive injuries of those hammer blows as well. So she's got all that going on with her head. She's in shock. She's running. And as you say, she's been hit from behind by this bull bar. By her own description, she says she went flying. She reckons she flew a couple of feet in the air when she got hit by that bull bar for the first time, landed on her hands and knees, picked herself up and kept going because she did not want to die that day. She said every mental image she had was that she was going to end up getting killed and getting buried under a sand dune, and her family would never, ever know what happened to her. And while she was, on the one hand, convinced there was no escape, she was determined she was not going to make it easy for him in any way, shape or form. He ran her down 3 more times with that car.
At one point, she actually went under the car, didn't she?
She did, that's right. Just before the final impact, she actually managed to get herself under the car and he passed over her, turned around, came back, and before she could get away enough, hit her with the car again.
And then she managed to sort of manoeuvre herself onto the car.
I've got to admit, these 2 women, look, this is a really weird thing to say, and especially a weird thing to say at this point in the telling. This is one of my favourite cases that I've ever covered. And the reason being, it's 2 incredibly brave women who completely outwit, outlast, and outsmart a predator. He's got every advantage. He's got the weapons. He's got the ropes. He's got the home field advantage. He's got the car. And yet they're going to beat him. That's what's great about this story, because at this moment where it should be absolutely all over for Lena, 4 blows to the head, ragged scalp wound, run down repeatedly by a car on the other side of the world with no help coming, she lures him into a bog and she gets him bogged. How incredible is that? She actually surveys the terrain enough to realise that's a deep bit there. If I run through that, he'll go straight in. So she gets the car bogged and climbs up on top, hangs onto his roof rack and says, "I'm not coming down."
And what does he do at that stage?
He manages to get himself out of that first bog and starts driving at full pace, trying to knock her off the car, trying to shake her off. And I mean, this was one of the points that defense counsel would seize on during Roman Heinze's trial, because how Hollywood does it sound? You know, driving around the sand dunes with your victim hanging onto the roof for dear life. It doesn't sound plausible. Yet, that's exactly what happened. She hung on for about another kilometre until, sure enough, Roman bogged himself again. And then it gets ludicrous because he leans out the window and says, "Can you hand me the shovel?"
And what does she say to that?
I don't think your audience allows me to swear, does it?
You're allowed to swear.
I think she pretty much tells him to get fucked. She pretty much tells him to get fucked. There's no way she's handing him a shovel. 2 reasons. Number 1, everything you've just done to me. And number 2, how do I know you're not going to just hit me with it? Just brain me with it and end it here. So then we move into the phase of bargaining. The guy that has had every advantage, the guy who had this plan to take these young women to this middle of nowhere place and have his wicked way with one of them and kill the other, suddenly has to bargain with his victim to get a shovel. Lena cool-headedly manages to negotiate that you will let me back in the car, you will not touch me, you will give me my bag, you will give me my hat, you will give me something to staunch my head wound, and you will drive me back to the gates. If you agree to all of that, I will give you the shovel.
And does he agree?
He does agree. He's got no choice at this point unless he wants to walk. And by this point, he's panicking because he's got no idea where Beatriz is. It's getting dark, and for all he knows, Beatriz has managed to find help.
He was like, "Get off the roof, like, I'm not driving any further with you on the roof." And he said, this is ridiculous. I remember that he said that, and I was like, why is it ridiculous? Like, why should I come off the roof? You tried to kill me. Like, why should I even trust you? So I told him, I only come off the roof if you throw away your weapons.
So at this point, we've got Lena in the car.
On the car.
On the car. And we've got Beatriz. What's happened to her? Because she hid. And what's happened since? When that's all when he's been pursuing Lena, what's happened with Beatriz?
Yep, so while he's busy pursuing Lena, Beatriz is hiding, shivering. It's getting dark. It's getting cold. And she manages to notice that there are other cars coming down the beach. This stretch of Salt Creek, as I said, goes for miles and miles and miles. But the entrance to get off the beach is right near where she is. So she's seeing these cars leaving for the day, cars that have no idea what's going on in the sand dunes. And she runs out and flags one down. She says to herself, it can't be him. It's a different colour. It's definitely not the same car. I've got to take the opportunity. So this woman runs out into the middle of the beach, completely naked, and flags down this car, help me, please. And thankfully, it is a car full of Muslim Australians visiting from Melbourne, the poor buggers, who are just confronted by this sight of this Brazilian woman, stark naked, terrified, screaming for help.
And do they take her to the police? Are the police sort of onto him pretty quickly?
Well, at this moment, the police have got no idea what's going on because Salt Creek is so remote that the nearest police station is 2 hours away.
Mm.
So this young Muslim family looks and says, we need to help her. One guy actually removes all his own clothing and dresses Beatriz in his clothing to protect her dignity and modesty, which is just wonderful. Like, what an incredibly generous thing to do at that time. They wrap her up with blankets and they say, we're getting you out of here. And Beatriz says, no, you've got to turn around. My friend is out there somewhere.
So what do the family do?
The family do a U-turn and they look as much as they can on the beach and they say, look, we can't find her. We're going to have to take you. We've got to get you some help. And she says, all right. As they're leaving, there's another group of campers coming in to the entrance. And so these two cars speak to each other and say, this is what's going on. Other people are now starting to look for the German girl. They're starting to look for Lena everywhere they go. Meantime, Beatriz is taken back to the Salt Creek Roadhouse. The owner of the Salt Creek Roadhouse is informed what's going on. He rings the police and says, you need to get down here as quickly as you can. One person station, 2 hours away. Meantime, he mounts up everybody he can and says, let's go hunting. We've got to try to find this girl before something terrible happens to her. So you've got search parties finally making their way down the beach as Beatriz is being cared for at the Salt Creek Roadhouse. Meantime, Lena's managed to strike her demon's bargain with Roman, and she's sitting in the front seat of his car as he's slowly driving over the sand dunes, driving them back. And she's watching him like a hawk. She's wrapped up. She's got a towel around her head. She's got her hat on top of the towel. She's got her bags in the back seat, watching him like a hawk while he drives her back, supposedly, to the entrance. Once they come out of the sand dunes onto the foreshore, Roman sees all these cars, the search parties that are looking for him. He decides that he's going to take off.
Does he leave her?
No, he starts to take off and he drives past these cars. Lena leans out the window. Now, she's fairly weak from blood loss at this point. She's very tired, obviously very concussed. She leans out the window and waves at these cars as much as she possibly can. All they see is a woman and blood. And thankfully one of them does, because he yells out to the others, that must be them, so they give chase. Heinze goes to turn to go back into the sand dunes again. And what happens? He bogs himself a third time. Lena at that point realizes this is the moment. She says, I calmly looked at him. I opened the door. I got out of the car. I opened the back door. I took my bags out and said, I'm leaving. I'm going to them now. And Roman goes, please stay. We can sort this out. And she doesn't even answer him. She just turns around, throws her bags on the ground, takes her hat off, takes the towel off her head, and starts staggering toward the rescuers, while Roman unbogs himself and drives off into the sand dunes. Here's one of the moments that will never leave me in the descriptions that were given at trial. As Lena's walking toward her rescuers, as I said to you earlier, she's only about 5 foot tall. It's getting dark. She was so covered in blood that her rescuers could not tell whether she was male or female, what colour her skin was, what colour her hair was, or what colour her clothing was. All they could see was this dark, bloody, humanoid shape staggering toward them. And they were so scared by that they wouldn't approach her. They let her approach them.
Roman had just driven through the campsite, and one of the boys in particular had a really good view. Noticed that in the passenger seat was a young girl covered in blood, and all they could see was an arm waving. And then they roared off up the beach.
Yeah, I can't even imagine that sight after, the intensity of that violence over that period of time. And did she...
Not at all.
She was rushed to hospital, I would imagine?
She was rushed at least back to the Salt Creek Roadhouse because, again, you're in the middle of nowhere. The nearest hospital is several hours away too. So it's a matter of getting her back to the Roadhouse, which, with the trip that I described on the way in, is not a short trip anyway. So there's one car taking her back, staunching her blood flow, trying to keep her conscious, trying to make sure she's all right, while the rest of the crew start chasing Roman through the sand dunes.
And did they eventually secure him?
They did. He went in and throughout the sand dunes for a little while, and then when he couldn't escape them, he came back onto the beach, bogged it again, story of his life tonight, and that's when they managed to actually prise him out of the car and pull him down. By that point, the police weren't far away and came and arrested him.
And this man, Roman, what do we know about who he was? Was he someone who had a history of violence?
Let me tell you about Roman Heinze. So Roman Heinze was a twice married father of 5. He was originally a chef. He gave up that career to care for his father after his mother and eldest brother died. This is a man who seemed completely respectable on the surface, but he was trawling Gumtree constantly for young, single backpackers who were looking for places to go and messaging them, offering to take them places, because he was looking to satisfy a different kind of appetite. Heinze was a massive collector of violent bondage pornography. And I'm not talking the sort of stuff that is between consenting adults. I'm talking the sort of stuff that leads you to Google the sentence, "Do Japanese women like to be raped?"
Had he acted on these sorts of impulses before?
One of Roman's former domestic partners alleged in court that she had been tied up, bitten, and abused by him one night. But those charges were not resulting in a conviction, unfortunately, for that woman. There was a Japanese backpacker who, not long before Beatriz and Lena, chose to accept a lift from Roman. But she got some sort of radar sense very quickly that something was off. So she made sure she was taking lots of photos on her phone during their trip and uploading them to Facebook so that her family knew where she was. When they got to Salt Creek, they got all the way to Salt Creek before he found out that she was doing this, and they were there for about an hour before he said, "Oh, I think I should take you home." So clearly, this was something that he had been fantasizing about and planning for some time. The kicker to all that is, of course, any time you've got any form of digital device, you can go back and see the last time a file was viewed, right?
Yeah.
The last time Roman had accessed his violent pornography collection was on his phone in the hours before he picked Beatriz and Lena up.
So that was clearly some sort of plan. That was a premeditated attack.
How many people go on a camping trip carrying pre-cut lengths of rope and a knife? How many people stick a hammer down the back of their pants to go looking for kangaroos? The elements of premeditation in this were off the charts. This man was a serial rapist waiting to happen. The only thing he'd been denied so far was an opportunity. And I personally think, had Beatriz gone on that trip on her own, this would be a very different story. I don't think she would have been able to survive simply because of, despite her bravery, despite her cleverness, I don't think she would have been able to survive because of the isolation and the sheer power imbalance. It's the fact that those two women had each other to rely on and each other to rescue one another that they were able to survive, because Lena rescued Beatriz when Beatriz called out for her, rescued her a second time by untying her. But then Beatriz rescued Lena by making sure people knew she needed to be looked out for, that someone had to go back and find her. You know, this is, as I said to you, two women who together triumphed over this sick predator.
And it's such a story of bravery for that reason too, because you could see your instincts kicking in for sort of self-preservation. But it's a case of them, I mean, the concern for one another, especially given they had only met very recently. They weren't siblings, they weren't lifelong friends. They were, you know, just people who had met on a trip.
That's right. Two women on the other side of the world, fellow backpackers, sharing that commonality of experience, but little else. You know, Beatriz said, I felt like I was in the final part of a horror movie where you don't even need to watch the ending because you know the hero is going to die. You know, you may as well just switch it off. When he had that knife and he had that rope, that was it. I was dead. Mum was going to have to come and identify my body. I was going to break everybody's hearts. Like you say, survival instinct is I will do everything I can to get myself out of this. But their instinct was we will do everything to get each other out of this. I mean, how terrifying would it be in that situation to have to split up, knowing that you have a 50-50 chance of the guy with the hammer and the four-wheel drive coming after you? He went after Lena, in my opinion, because he wanted to kill her. She was an impediment. She had to be moved out of the way before he could have his way with Beatriz. Beatriz was his target. That's who he wanted to rape. That's who he wanted to spend time with in the most disgusting, criminal, carnal manner. Lena was the impediment, and I think she enraged him to the point where it became a battle of wills between the two of them.
The sadistic predator who kidnapped and terrorised two backpackers on their way to Melbourne can finally be unmasked. The evil grandfather subjected the young women to a sickening ordeal on a remote South Australian beach.
Face down in the Coorong sand, his hands cuffed behind his back, this is the moment Roman Heinze's reign of terror came to an end.
I'm going to stay here with you. Hey, do you understand that you're under arrest? Yeah.
Hours earlier, he'd tied up and sexually assaulted a 23-year-old Brazilian woman on the beach, threatening her with a knife. Her German travelling mate came to her rescue, but Heinze struck her multiple times in the head with a hammer before repeatedly ramming her with his four-wheel drive.
She looked like she had dark skin, but then when she got closer we realised it was just dried blood mixed with fresh blood.
She ran straight to the car yelling, opened the back door, jumped straight in and just like, get me out of here, get me out of here. Yeah, just, he's going to kill us all.
And when he finally faced a court, what was he convicted of and what was his sentence?
He was convicted of multiple counts of assault, of attempted rape, attempted sexual assault, violence, and those sorts of offences. He was jailed for at least 22 years. In sentencing, Justice Trish Kelly declared him an inhuman, primitive, sex-obsessed predator who already does and will continue to pose a danger to young women so long as he lives. He's got to serve at least 17 years behind bars before he can even apply for parole. And Justice Kelly said, I have no reason to believe that you will ever rehabilitate. Your offences were utterly depraved. Yours is not the conduct of a civilised human being, but an enraged and somewhat primitive man lacking any moral compass whatsoever.
I just wanted to ask, just before we conclude, what do we know about Lena and Beatriz now in terms of recovery, both physically and psychologically?
We don't know an awful lot. The only reason we can even say their names is because the two of them have consented to those names being released. Under South Australian law, and indeed under most mainland states, the law says you can never identify the victim of a sexual offence or give any information that tends to identify that victim without their consent. Now, Lena, of course, is not a victim of any form of sexual offence. Beatriz is. So we couldn't name Lena if we couldn't name Beatriz. The two of them chose to go public together, to tell their story together and to stand together while that story was told, which says an awful lot about their courage, their tenacity, and their ability to move on. The little bit we do know is that Lena chose to stay in Australia for a period we're not sure whether she's still in Australia now, and continue travelling around. She told Roman to his face in court, "You will not destroy my love for this country. You will not destroy my dream of seeing this country." Beatriz, the last we understand, went back to Brazil and unfortunately found herself living a fairly sheltered life. She was uncomfortable being in crowds. She was uncomfortable being in public, and would spend an awful lot of time in a very secure environment, a gated community. And I believe, as far as I know, she and her Australian-born boyfriend are still a couple. Whether they're living between Australia and Brazil, or whether they're simply living in Brazil now, is something I don't know. But if there are two women who deserve their privacy now, I think these are the ones.
Absolutely. And it's difficult to imagine how you could go back to living a normal life. And even that, I mean, that resilience is pretty admirable.
Absolutely. These are, I mean, I've been covering courts in South Australia for 18 years, and this would have to be the single biggest example of bravery by a victim of crime I've ever seen. And that's a big call, because most victims of crime who survive are incredibly courageous. The strength that it takes to come back from the absolute worst of human behaviour being perpetrated on you is unfathomable. And I have nothing but respect for every victim of crime I've ever dealt with in my career. But then there's these two women who are on a level again. You know, the story surrounding them is Hollywood material. You know, I remember the first time I heard what Lena's evidence was going to be about being up on the car and things like that, I thought, that can't possibly be right. Like, she must have been so concussed from the hammer blows and from the bull bar strikes that she imagined that part of it. But no, she didn't. She's that tenacious. She's that strong. They have responded in a superhuman way to an extraordinary situation. And that makes this a good story, like I said, because they survived and they beat him.
Yeah, and he's exactly where he needs to be. You know, and as the judge said, that's not a man who looks like he can be rehabilitated.
The kicker to the lack of rehabilitation is that the last time I saw Roman in court, he was suing his son because he wanted possession of his boat, his antique pillowcases, his old furniture, and all sorts of things so that he can sell it all and fund a challenge to the High Court, because he's not guilty, goddammit, no matter what anybody says. And he'll take his case to the High Court, provided his, quote, money-grubbing turd, unquote, of a son will release all of his property. This is the man who then filed a lawsuit against South Australia Police for seizing and destroying the vehicle that he used to run down Lena, saying, "Oh, it actually belonged to my late brother and you stolen it by seizing it from me." He has absolutely no remorse, absolutely no contrition, and the only person he is interested in is Roman Heinze.
That's incredible, especially a man who was caught at the scene. There is no question of his guilt.
None whatsoever.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
I just think he is just like a sick person. I'm happy that he won't harm other people, so I'm happy. That's it, you know. I don't want to have any bad feelings, because any bad feeling that I have, it's gonna affect me and just me. So it's not worth it.
I had no idea that this was inside me, that I had such a strength and energy to do all those things. That's a good point about the whole story that I found out about myself, that I'm able to do something like that in a really difficult situation.
You can find Sean Fewster's reporting on this case via the link in the description of this episode. He tweets at Sean Fewster, and his book City of Evil is available at all good bookstores and online. Images, videos and maps relating to this episode can be found in our closed Facebook group. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join the group. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper.